I think we are having something that is almost literally like a collective psychotic break.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Lockdown TV from Unheard. So today we are joined from Portland, Oregon in the US by Bret Weinstein. He is an evolutionary biologist, a public intellectual, and host of the Dark Horse podcast. So can you see me, Bret?
I can see
Very
you
good.
very well.
Okay, let's kick off with of all of the many stories that are circling around, we are just moments away from a presidential election. We have terrorist acts on the streets of France. We in the UK are now just about to enter another full national lockdown. It really feels like everything is happening at once. And yet I wanted to start as a kind of way to launch into those bigger themes with something that's happened to you recently, which is that your Facebook account got locked, or you got kind of kicked out of it. What actually happened with that?
Well, it's interesting. This was now a week or so ago. I am not a heavy user of Facebook. At one time, I was a regular user, but after the meltdown at the college where I worked for 14 years, Facebook became quite toxic, and so I stopped using it. I kept my account and only occasionally logged in. But a friend posted a link in a chat to something that he saw on Facebook. I attempted to look at it, and when I went to Facebook, I got a notice that said that my account had been closed, that a review had already been conducted, and that there was no reversal possible. I was simply out. And this shocked me because I hadn't done anything that could conceivably have triggered this. I posted the notice that I saw to my Twitter account, which has a large number of followers, and it went viral. And this seems to have caused the reinstatement of my account. The only information I got was a reply posted by somebody who said they were with Facebook Comms, a woman named Liz Shepard, and she said that it had been an error, that I had triggered a system for detecting inauthentic accounts, which is preposterous in light of how longstanding my account was, and that they regretted the error. And I was back. And then this morning, I started getting messages from friends of mine that I was again gone. When I went to log in, I still seem to be there. So I don't know if this is just a glitch or if something else has happened, but I will say it is ominous. I am seeing reports of many other people who are being purged, including friends of mine, and I do have the sense that something is up behind the scenes at Facebook, probably some kind of internal conflict between those who apparently don't like heterodox thinking and those who wish to see us remain.
So we had a kind of similar story here at Lockdown TV. We had one of our videos with a guy called Carol Sikora, who's a wonderful kind of public health expert. He's constantly on the BBC. He's not even very controversial in that sense, but he was kind of sharing his views on the pandemic, and mysteriously the video disappeared. It breached guidelines, was all we were told. We then did a kind of appeal, which was immediately rejected. And at that point, any normal kind of civilian has no further recourse. We, rather like you, luckily have a kind of a big Twitter following, and we caused a bit of a fuss on Twitter. Suddenly, the YouTube, help was there on Twitter, and miraculously, it was restored again with a similar kind of, it was a mess up, some sort of administrative error. We need to be careful not to be overly paranoid here. Clearly, this video is going to be on YouTube, so they're not against us having this conversation. What do you think is a kind of reasonable level of anxiety about this?
Oh, I think it would be hard to overstate the danger, which doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't mistakes happening of a mundane nature and that it would be easy to misinterpret them as personal. But what we know is that because effectively the public square is now happening in a private place, that the protections that we need in order for pluralistic society to function have been unhooked. And so we have seen many cases in which we do know why people were evicted for various platforms. Many of the explanations have been preposterous. And it is therefore, I believe, absolutely warranted that we consider how it is that we get free speech protections to apply to those places where speech is actually taking place. And that could be that there needs to be a parallel on-ramp to the internet so that we are not constrained effectively to private venues. Or it could be that these are effectively like public utilities, and although they are private concerns, that we have a right and, in fact, a duty to regulate them so they remain open.
You might be right that there is a kind of ideological conflict within Facebook, or I would suggest more likely, and I would say just as sinister, is the chance that it's a kind of combination of algorithms flagging things based on kind of big principles, and then, kind of middle-ranking people just sort of rubber stamping them. You reach the ceiling, and you have no recourse. There's no way to appeal, and suddenly you have been silenced. And that, I think, is a really frightening prospect.
Well, I'll go you one better on really frightening. I agree with you, and I have a similar model in which many of the things that feel conspiratorial are actually a combination of phenomena. One part is emergent and one part is conscious, and the two of them work together to create, exactly as you say, something quite Soviet and bureaucratic. But there's another possibility here that needs to be in the mix, which is that if one wants to do arbitrary things, if one wants to silence certain kinds of speech and amplify other kinds of speech because they are advancing a political agenda, then they can build a system in which, A, your antagonists are in a position to trigger algorithms. We saw this on Twitter with the Unity 2020 proposal. And then once your antagonists have triggered something, they've triggered a process, then judgment is completely outside of any recourse. So in essence, if you build a system in which everybody is in violation of the rules at all times, as long as one squints at it in the right way, then you are completely free to decide one way or the other as the mood suits you. So we are in deep trouble because the process isn't transparent and there are no rules about how it should proceed. And until we have at least a process where we all understand what the rules are that we are not allowed to violate, and when we are told that we have violated them, we are allowed to see what the evidence is and to challenge it.
Right.
Until we have that process, we are in danger of being effectively ruled by the whims of the people who run these platforms.
And what I think is what is so particularly interesting about it is that they're kind of the epitome or the perfect symbol of the kind of faceless global entities that people have been rebelling against in recent years. Headquartered maybe in California, but they exist all over the world, and that they are unregulated properly by the different democracies, and so there's a sort of quite tyrannical sense of a powerful body that is really not held to account anywhere.
Yes, it's obviously anti-democratic, and the fact that it is also, not only is it unanticipated by the formal and informal documents that govern the nations in which these things are run, but it was impossible for it to have been anticipated. In the U.S., the founders never saw a chainsaw or a train or a bicycle. They had no idea what kind of world we would be living in. And so they feared the wrong things, as anybody living in that era would have. And now that we know what the hazard to speech is in the 21st century, we have to upgrade these protections.
And I guess the kind of political aspect of it, which sort of leads us into some of these bigger political questions, is that headquartered as the tech platforms are in California, they are kind of deeply full of a sort of liberal way of thinking, and many of the young people who kind of populate their staffs will be of one mind about those issues. And so it becomes political because, in the case of our video, the CEO of YouTube wishing to do her best in the kind of fight against the global pandemic, wanted to show how virtuous she was being, so she's put in place various rules that anything which would be anti-science or misinformation would be taken down, and possibly they got those rules wrong, but you get a sort of a certain worldview being entrenched and policed throughout all of these platforms.
Well, I take exception. I know you're speaking generally. I wouldn't call the political ideology that is so dominant in these platforms liberal. It's clearly illiberal, but it is nominally on the left. And the fact that it is political at all is an incredible hazard. Now, the part that I find a little surprising, the naivete that rises to a level I didn't necessarily expect, is that the people who are deciding what these rules are, even when they're well intentioned, even when their purpose is to prevent misinformation about viral spread, for example, they have failed to comprehend that there has never been a moment when it was possible to draw that line well. That is to say, there in every era are bad takes, dangerous takes, political takes, and we'd be better off without them. But the reason that we protect speech in the way that we do, the reason that we protect vile speech, is because heterodox speech travels in a murky gray area. Nobody knows how to draw the line between false ideas and ideas that are ahead of their time, for example. So in the case of the pandemic, we are seeing the emergence of evidence that leaves many questions wide open that are politically inconvenient for one side or the other. And to have tech platforms with no scientific guidance deciding that what is the conventional wisdom in a certain quadrant of the academy is therefore the truth, and one cannot discuss failures of that conclusion it's mind blowing, and we simply have to protect more speech than people would like to hear in order to protect heterodox speech.
It does seem, at least over here, and I suspect maybe even more so in the US, that this is becoming incredibly politicized as well, and that there's a sort of high status, virtuous view, and then there's a kind of low status, irresponsible view, and it's really frightened me, actually, because on this channel we've been having a lot of dissenting, but also people who took the more consensus view, and this should be a public policy question. We should be learning from evidence. We should be constantly challenging it, and it should not be a kind of good or evil question that you can use to kind of shut people down. Have you noticed that same tendency in the US?
Oh my goodness, it's appalling. The fact that this has been politicized is a huge failure of our system, and the consequences of it are absolutely dire. What it's done in the U.S. is it's caused us to steer a kind of middle ground that makes no sense whatsoever from a public health perspective, has completely failed to control the virus, has isolated the U.S. and made us, at least temporarily, a kind of pariah. Let's be clear about it, though. There is a part of this, the lion's share, that shouldn't be in any way controversial. We should all agree that it is in our interest to control the virus and that is largely a scientific question. What is the best approach to do that? And then there are places where we might have room for some disagreement. In other words, you can imagine people with different priorities to their values ranking the need to protect people from risk differently in comparison to the need to keep the economy humming. And there's a real discussion to be had there. Obviously, growth is built into the mechanism that feeds people. And so there are costs both ways.
I think a lot of people put the blame for that sort of tribal atmosphere on either on Donald Trump personally or on that sort of side of the argument, and I'm sure he has a good fair bit of blame to take, but we started this conversation talking about the tech platforms and that kind of technocratic, unself-questioning view that then kind of censors anyone who questions it. That also has a very tribal atmosphere. And all it does is it makes the people who take a different view more conspiratorial, more angry, less likely to agree, and consensus is even harder to get to. So I really feel like both sides of this have some blame.
Well, anybody who is concerned that they won't get their fair share of blame doesn't need to worry because there's plenty to go around. And, yes, Donald Trump did some appalling things with respect to COVID-19. And, he did politicize it, as he does everything. On the other hand, having tech platforms pretending that they are in a position to render scientific judgment about really important questions like how exactly did this virus end up spreading through the world, right? They absolutely shut down perfectly reasonable lines of inquiry because they found them inconvenient, right? That it has done everything to amplify the sense that this is teams playing with the details of other people's lives as if it were sport.
It feels to me like this year we sort of turned a corner, and our kind of shared assumptions, many of them are no longer there.
I think we are having something that is almost literally like a collective psychotic break. I think we are now linked together in something. It is not entirely novel. Human beings have always plugged into each other's mindset and done a lot of emergent cognition. But the scale at which we are doing it and the directness of our connection to each other is now such that we are in a position to go crazy together. And I think that's what's happening. What you're describing is more or less a kind of paranoia about very normal things like discussion. And if there's one piece of advice that I would give people, it's to stop leaping to conclusions about other people's motives in raising questions. The fact is, we are trapped together on a tiny little rock. The way that this works out well is if we are allowed to discuss things, if we extend generosity of spirit to each other and give people room to explore a wrong idea, discover it's wrong, and then back away from it rather than assume they're up to something as they say something that doesn't match what we think we understand.
Do you think there's any hope of it getting better anytime soon? I mean, this is the big question, isn't it? And I guess regardless of what happens in the coming days, and it may be longer than that, around the election, what is the mechanism for bringing people back together and trying to reestablish some kind of at least framework of what the argument can be about?
Well, I don't want to say that I'm hopeful because I think I'm as worried as anyone about what's about to unfold. But if we think about this from the perspective of my discipline, which is evolutionary biology, there is a phenomenon that we are aware of, which is that in order to go from one state to a better state, one often has to go through what we call an adaptive valley, that is, a state that's worse. And it is only by going through the worst state that we can actually go through the phase transition. So that means that when you are headed somewhere good, it will often look very, very dark. And I'm not saying that this is the darkness and we are definitely going somewhere that's more positive. I think the outcome is more likely to be a disaster. But it means that if we were going to change the way we did things, if we were going to upgrade our systems to deal with modern realities and to prevent, future outbreaks of conflict and things like that, if we were going to actually accomplish something like that, it's almost guaranteed that we would have to go through a period of deep uncertainty to get there.
It does feel like that now, doesn't it? You can sort of feel the cord snapping of a previous system. And I suppose it remains to be seen whether we better it or whether, as you say, disaster comes. But that's what we're here trying to do, to try and do a tiny little bit to steer it in the right direction.
Well, I will say that the suspicion that people in the West seem to have of a large fraction of their fellow citizens is not going to help. you have to imagine that we have an awful lot at stake together in order to begin to figure out what to do next. And it does seem that the tribalism, the politicization, and the technical amplification of those tribal allegiances is making us finding our way out of this dark period less likely. We should put some thought into that.
You're in Portland. Obviously, that city has got a lot of publicity over the summer months, and still more recently after the protests kind of got a bit out of hand. What is the experience of life in Portland now? And do you see it as a kind of example made real of what happens when these kind of ideologies go too far and start really literally breaking out onto the street?
Yes, this is an important question, and I think it is especially important that we figure out how to convey under lockdown the experience that we are all having to outsiders, because we tend to leap to the conclusion that there are slight aesthetic variations between these major cities in the West, and in fact, that's not the case at the moment. So Portland is mostly intact, but the energy in the system has built up. There's a tremendous amount of pressure. And what's more, that pressure has taken a form that is quite ominous. We have absolutely regular violence breaking out on the streets of Portland. It's always localized to a few blocks because it's a small number of people who are engaged in it. But the police are simply not putting a stop to it. And the protesters, who every night become rioters, are learning what they can get away with. And they are frankly going neighborhood to neighborhood and terrorizing business owners. They're terrorizing people in their homes. And perhaps most ominous of all, the mayor, who is also our police commissioner, who is allowing this to happen, is facing a challenge for office, which might ordinarily be a good thing, except that he's being challenged by somebody who actually has signaled quite strongly that she embraces the wrongly labeled anti-fascist perspective in this case. And so I think a lot of us who 3 months ago would have had an almost impossible time imagining ourselves voting for our current mayor in light of how he has botched the crisis so far, are actually voting for him and rooting for him and dismayed that he may lose because things could get far worse.
Has there not been a kind of reality candidate thrown up, a sort of restore law and order candidate?
I hate to say it. I am a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. I believe strongly that we will have to make progress if we are to survive as a species, and that means I regard myself as a radical. But what I'm watching is people who are nominally on the same side of the political spectrum who do not appear to understand that systems have basic requirements in order to function, that these systems are necessary to our continued existence, and that they are jeopardizing them because in a state where one party effectively has complete control, there is no force to cause a reality check. In effect, people's fantasies have run away with them, and they do not seem to understand that they are playing with the substance of our real lives as if it were a video game.
But so this is the bit I'm genuinely confused by. You describe these scenes on the streets of downtown Portland. Presumably the residents of Portland see that as well. So there is evidence there that if there are real world bad outcomes if you continue to make these kind of mistakes. Why are your fellow residents not changing their view when they see how bad things are getting?
I think the answer comes down to an unfortunate piece of game theory. which suggests that people have a tremendous amount to lose if they acknowledge that the runaway liberalism, again, it's not really liberalism, it's illiberal, but the apparent runaway liberalism is something they would like to see reined in. That is immediately labeled as fascist and authoritarian. And so people are very quiet about the fact that they don't like what they're seeing. But the downstream consequence of that is that having effectively lied in order not to trigger the mob's ire, people are left in the very awkward situation of, well, they have severe cognitive dissonance. And I think what happens next is they convince themselves that they actually believe what it is that they've said they believe. And the real question is, how will that affect the way they vote? Will they vote as if somebody is looking over their shoulder? And will they vote for the wrong thing, thinking their votes are not very important? Or will they say to heck with it, and because nobody is looking over their shoulder, vote for the candidate who is more in favor of the rule of law, even though that candidate has been incredibly weak in challenging these violent rioters?
Does that make you suspect that the current president will do better than polls suggest?
I think Trump is going to perform way better than people expect. There's no question that there is an Orwellian force that causes people to think twice before they confess even any nuance about Trump. Effective. I mean, I saw Noam Chomsky in the New Yorker a couple days ago said Donald Trump was the worst criminal in human history, which is a preposterous statement coming from a place you would really expect a great deal more nuance than that. And yet here we are. That passes for intellectual evaluation at this moment. So undoubtedly, there are a large number of people who are frightened by the Democrats' willingness to pretend that this authoritarian mindset is reasonable. Whether they are doing it cynically or not, they are certainly sending those signals. It's frightening a lot of people. And I will tell you that privately, I hear lots of folks who would describe themselves as never Trumpers who are actually saying they don't have a choice. And that's not what I did. But I will say I hear it enough that I feel confident Trump will outperform expectations. Whether he'll win, I think he actually might well, but he is going to surprise people one way or the other.
Let me put an alternative framing to you, which maybe is even more worrying, which is that it's not madness, that it's just that the country, like so much of the Western world, has fundamentally divided in terms of what kind of world they want to inhabit and what the values of that world should be. And so that there isn't enough common ground anymore. And once you reach that point, for both of those two groups, it is logical to just try and defeat the other because there is no accommodation to be made anymore. It's bleak, but tell me why that's wrong.
Oh, no, that doesn't sound bleak to me at all. That sounds like, in some sense, more hopeful than what I think is actually going on.
Because, oh, wow, okay, we're getting...
Yeah, it's pretty dark here. What I would say is we know that you're right to an extent. We are having a fundamental disagreement about something. The problem is that disagreement is predicated on a fictional premise. So what I would say is we have a fantastically productive system, the spoils of which are unfairly distributed, right? That's just a literal description of where we are. We have two concepts of what might be done about this. You could adjust the way the spoils are distributed, which is probably a long-term proposal, not very sexy. It's more or less the direction that we have been going, and there's room for a lot of work to be done there. And then there is a proposal effectively to topple the system as if the unfairness in the way things are distributed is the core of the system. And what that second perspective misses is that the unfairly distributed productivity is still massive, and that essentially everybody will be harmed. In absolute terms, everybody will come out worse off than they were if we disrupt the system that produces the productivity. And this is where I think people are effectively looking at this in video game terms rather than real terms. They simply do not understand that, for example, if you have bad policing, you are still way better off than no policing, right? The idea that abolishing the police is a solution to police brutality or some kind of arbitrariness is preposterous. The fact that there is a police force, even an arbitrary one, is restraining a violent impulse that has characterized much of human history. Are we going to have to uninvent police in order to discover that? Maybe. It's
Well, it
looking
sort
like
of
we're playing
happened
with those.
a little bit, didn't it, in Seattle and elsewhere?
It happened at my college. It happened in Seattle. It's effectively happening in a more subtle way in Portland. But there's even a cryptic way that it's taking over most major cities, which is that by allowing the police to be demonized and taunted, we're making the job much less appealing. In any case, my basic point is people are failing to calibrate for how much this system, which is rigged, is doing for them, even in its rigged state. And they are threatening to sink the ship that they are on with no plan for what it is that's going to prevent them from drowning.
What's interesting is that radicals on both the left and the right want to destroy the system. So what you're kind of describing there are the kind of woke activists who want to destroy the system they feel is rigged in a particular way. But a lot of the energy that elected Donald Trump in the first place was a sense that the system is rigged and he was going to drain the swamp and fix it. And there's not a lot of affection for the system on that part of the right either. At some point, they're just going to be overthrown, aren't they, by these two groups who have no love for the system?
Well, I find myself in an awkward position here because I am very focused on what our system doesn't do well, and I think it demands upgrade. But I also think that the long-term pattern has been one of upgrade, and the idea that we are going to reverse course now is absurd. So, at some level, somebody needs to spell out the argument for keeping the system, the basics of it, and achieving what the system aspires to but does not achieve. I think this is really the core of it, is that we have arrived actually on both left and right. People have arrived at a basic description of the ideal system. And I don't mean a utopia. All right. I think utopia is the worst idea humans ever came up with. But I do mean a system that functions in a kind of optimal way. We know what it looks like. We haven't come close to it yet, but we have been moving in that direction. That is to say, things like racism, which are distortions that function against that ideal structure, have reduced over time greatly, dramatically. And the answer is we need to complete that project. We do not want to upend it because the world that preceded this pluralistic experiment that we have been running in the West for a couple hundred years now, that world that preceded it was a much more arbitrary, unfair, rigged world. And anybody who understood what it looked like in comparison to this one wouldn't want to return there.
We're going for system upgrade, not system destruction. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I would say we are facing a couple problems. One, the system was a prototype. It was a brilliant prototype, but all prototypes have deep flaws. And the reason that you make a prototype is so you discover what you didn't know and that your next version can solve, hopefully, the lion's share of the problems that you discovered in the first round. And we are also living in a different world. And so even if the system had gone through enough iterations that we had achieved what the founders set out to achieve, we would still be facing the need for a major upgrade in light of the realities of the 21st century. But yes, I think we're really talking about the need for our system 2.0, and that means actually the values that were spelled out in the launching of our system are correct, but our level of achievement relative to those values is beginning to underperform. The rate of improvement has gone down. Corruption has found its way through the cracks at a level that it is now causing that system to be captured almost across the board. And the problem is, as I hear myself describe this, the idea that this argument can be made to enough people that they would really understand what it is we stand to lose seems almost preposterous.
The question for the United States, and I think for the UK as well, is there a human being who a kind of ultra-metropolitan young liberal would buy into and support, but also someone in a rural part of the country who, basically wants to lead a much more traditional kind of life? Does that human being exist who could actually bring the country together around a sort of set of values and a system alongside it that could kind of begin to heal this, do you think?
Strong yes and strong no at the same time. I believe such people exist, that we've seen them, but that we have a political system that is absolutely terrified of them. In fact, I would argue that there is a cryptic rule on which both the Democrats and Republicans agree in the US, and that is there can be no meaningful change in the way power and well-being is distributed. So what that means is anybody who is earnestly interested in altering the system to make it work better is regarded as a threat by those for whom the system is working so beautifully. And what that means is that the political structure that they have captured kills off any attempt to bring sanity. And, we saw this very clearly on the Democratic side, both in 2020 and in 2016. We saw it on the Republican side. Now, interestingly, it failed on the Republican side. Trump was not the plan. The Republicans did not want to nominate him. And he won because he is a brilliant political creature. Now, the problem is he won on a platform of draining the swamp, but effectively he drained the swamp to put in a golf course. He's like a new crime family that has muscled his way in on the action. And that is not a solution to the problem, even if it is a challenge to the thing that was trying to keep out change. So I think this is part of where we're stuck, is that people detected something real about Trump, which was that he was honestly not from the map, right? He was from elsewhere, and he was a challenge to things that had a stranglehold on power, and he was capable of going the distance. But it's a dead end.
We're all still heirs of the 90s, really, aren't we? I mean, we had Tony Blair here, you had Bill Clinton over there. When there was a particular form of kind of left and right fusion that actually, although it felt very virtuous at the time, has left us with a whole load of problems decades later. And so both sides are suspicious of anything that looks like it's kind of trying to be a centrist. And I understand that. So how, somehow you need to say, okay, well, it's not that. It's a different kind of new way.
Well, the answer here is a funny one. The population is drenched in a kind of bullshit that is with them almost from the instant that they get up in the morning, right? As soon as you've engaged your phone, there's a pretty good chance you've encountered something inauthentic, some kind of advertising at least. And it's with us all day until we go to bed. That's not normal, right? Our ancestors didn't face that. There have always been con artists, but in general, that's not what you were dealing with moment to moment. What this has created is a kind of hunger that people don't realize they are experiencing for authenticity. And that paradoxically has created an opening for very unlikely phenomena. I mean, I feel weird because at the moment I'm talking about myself. I have a large platform, and it is largely, I think, the result of the fact that over time people have understood that I may not be right, but I'm certainly going to tell them what I think. And that is that feature, which might have been run of the mill 100 years ago, is now like the coin of the realm because we just don't see it very frequently. So, in any case, I guess what I'm telling you is that anecdotally, when people encounter authentic things, they react to it, whether they know what it is that they're gravitating to or not. And what that means is that somebody, the political leader you're talking about, has to basically function on the intuition that if they can stay out of the political milieu, that there will be a force that carries them to a position where they can actually do something. What I have seen, the tragedy of our system is that because the parties have such a stranglehold on power, even the excellent people who would do brilliantly if they made it to high office have to go through that door. And once you touch those parties, they own you. They own you in ways that those of us on the outside can't begin to imagine. And this results again and again in people who have great promise as leaders being upended or neutered or lobotomized or whatever it is that happens to them. So hopefully the absurdity of 2020 is enough to spur people to try to work outside of these structures so that they have a hope of arriving intact.
It feels like there are occasional resonances on the sort of radical left and the radical right, where they really sound kind of similar. There is a desire for a kind of more beautiful, simpler way of living, whether it's the kind of green agenda of the left or the kind of moral, Christian agenda in the right. There's a suspicion against kind of globalized capital and the kind of bad effects of how that system has worked for previous decades. So there's actually a kind of, there are moments of similarity that you could almost imagine someone picking up on and saying and bringing together a whole new coalition in a surprising way.
Well, I think you're conflating two things, at least in the American context. One, there's the sort of fringe right and fringe left, which do have an analogy. Basically, you've got two versions of racism is pretty good, but whether white is positive or negative is the thing that they differ over. But most of us are nowhere near those fringes. In fact, there's a report called the Hidden Tribes Report that I think is quite insightful, that looked at the American electorate and discovered that there is what they call the vast exhausted middle, something like 67% of us that agree on the basics. We're just not extreme, right? So, for example, we tend to see the need for some right to an abortion as important, but we don't see it as exclusively about the judgment of the mother. That is to say, the later in the pregnancy the question arises, the less we see that freedom as simple. So we do not get catered to. In fact, we, the exhausted middle, are fiercely divided over what amounts to uniforms, right? Whether you're wearing blue or red, and it's arbitrary. But the possibility of that vast exhausted middle realizing that our division is consciously or not serving someone else's interests and not ours does open the possibility for the kind of leader that you were mentioning that we need to arise and to find tremendous backing. In fact, what my guess is you don't hear in Britain, looking at our election, is that there are a tremendous number of voters who simply don't show up, not because they are apathetic, but because they are disaffected. And the experience of going to vote and seeing no one who represents your interests on the ballot is frustrating, and they've walked away. were they to come back because there was something to come back for, they'd be the most potent political force in the country.
Which sounds quite hopeful, Brett. I mean, we keep saying that we're not hopeful, but we keep accidentally stumbling on optimistic ideas here.
Well, I've been at this some time, and I've realized that I believe the possibility to save the system and actually to make it much, much better is right here in front of us, and that we could live in a vibrant Renaissance-like era if we were to embrace the challenge. But I also would bet against us, which I hate saying, but I just think the chances that we will not spot the opportunity and allow petty disagreements to prevent us from availing ourselves of it is more likely than not.
Well, history isn't written yet, so let's do our bit to make sure the first thing happens.
Hell yeah.
Brett Weinstein, thank you so much for joining us. That was really fascinating.
Thanks. This was great.
That was Brett Weinstein talking to us from Portland in Oregon about whether or not there is hope to save the system from itself. Well, we'll find out in a couple of days what happens in the presidential elections, but it seems like these ideas will last a long time after that. Thanks for joining. This was Lockdown TV.